Hello, my HS100 students. This is your Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is week 5 of the semester, and unfortunately I will not be able to teach in person on Tuesday, February 13th due to logistics and medical concerns regarding my partner. So I have other family related stuff that I need to do that's going to interfere with me being there in person. So instead of trying to be there for one, maybe 1.5 classes, I'm canceling class and giving you this sort of pre-recorded version of what I would normally do in class tomorrow. So my apologies for that. It's not these things happen. So anyway, the main thing I planned on covering, which I covered with 2 of my sections this past week in week 4, but I want to make sure I cover of all sections, are the themes in the lecture notes I provide you for the Great Migration of African Americans in the period between the 19-teens and 1930 regarding the Harlem Renaissance, and what does that have to do with the historiography of migration studies, and particularly black migration and black migration studies, and the themes of facts versus opinions versus interpretations. Okay, how does this all meld? Well, what we're dealing with right now are a certain set of interpretations with regard to black migration, its impact on black folk, how black folk responded to the racism and other isms that they had to encounter upon arrival at their destinations, whether it was Milwaukee or Minneapolis or Cleveland or Cincinnati or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. Notice them alliterating with the N's and the C's and the P's and the M's. So there's that around those sorts of things. The fact is, there was a migration. There was, many of these people originated from either the rural South or from cities of the South, having left the rural South earlier before going on this sort of migration up north or up south to places like Washington, D.C., Wilmington, Delaware, or Baltimore, Maryland, or going further north to the actual what we consider outside the South north, New York, Philly, Chicago, etc., etc. We've covered that. We've also covered a little bit about historiography, how the Kenneth Kuzmers and the Gilbert Osofskis and the other folks who've covered black migration tended to cover it only in terms of how the migration shaped what became by the 1960s and 70s the black ghetto, right? That's the themology around it and how they got to this interpretation. It really is what I'm going to talk about today, and tie in the Harlem Renaissance with that. For a good portion, as we've already covered, a good portion of the historiography, whether you're talking about journalists covering black migration in the 19-teens and 1920s, or whether you're talking about historians who decided roughly say 1930s, certainly in the 40s, definitely by the 60s to cover this phenomenon. They covered it mostly in terms of the impact of migration in terms of poverty on black folk, that upon arriving north they couldn't find the kind of work they needed, the kind of housing they needed, etc., etc. And this all led to an interpretation that basically said that there's a culture of poverty, of generational poverty that existed among these folk long before they came north, and they brought that cultural baggage with them to these cities, to the Clevelands and Chicagos and New Yorks. And as a result of that and certain things not working out for this population, there it is. You got black poverty, black ghettos, the end. That's their story. Well, as I said last week, David Levery Lewis's book, When Harlem Was in Vogue, published in 1981, it was not the first book to deal with this. W.B. Boyce had dealt with this in the 1930s in his book Black Reconstruction. Carter G. Woodson had dealt with this in the 1930s with the miseducation of the Negro. E. Franklin Frazier had dealt with this in the 1940s in his study of the Negro family in America. Gunnar Myrdal, a white sociologist, had dealt with this in his 2-volume study known as An American Dilemma. They all addressed this reality that, were not for systemic racism in a number of bases, then far more African Americans living in these expanding black communities due to black migration would have experienced more prosperity, and a lot of them would have left the working class, the working poor, and leapt into the lower middle class or middle class long before the 1960s and 70s. At least that's what they say. But mainstream historians covering black migration tended to stick with this sort of shtick, right? This is their interpretation based on the data that they have, right? Now, did they go through all the data? Did they, for the most part, even interview black migrants? Absolutely not. Because, as I said to you, oral histories with regard to these studies did not, were not accepted not accepted among historians. We're not accepted at all. So, at best, it's anecdotal evidence. At worst, it's just junk. It's just a junk way of doing research, as far as they are concerned. So, that's the reality of what we're talking about. But there are two things I want you to really focus on: reading the lecture notes and reading the readings that are assigned for this week that we will talk about on Thursday virtually, and doing those kinds of things. One thing you want to concentrate on is moving beyond this white gaze, G-A-Z-E, the white gaze, the glaring stare of white folk looking at black things and coming up with racist sort of interpretations of those kinds of things based on God's honest evidence in front of them, but not the evidence of the actual people who are living their lives through this process, right? So there's that. And that is that there is an intra-race component to this, that these communities were in fact not just made up of poverty, right? You could maybe make the argument that maybe 50, even 60% of black folk living in communities like Harlem, south side of Chicago, east side of east side of St. Louis, east side of Cleveland, etc., experience some sort of poverty as part of the large working poor. But if that's the case, then that probably means 40% of whites fit the same category during the same period of time, because being working class meant that you lived with some sort of deprivation, like you didn't have enough food, or you didn't have enough to pay your bills, etc., or buy a house, or what have you, right? That's just the reality of it. But there's always this other component. There's this component of black elites, not fully elite the way we understand elitism in the United States, meaning they weren't always rich, but usually they were at least middle class or solidly enough working class to where they could afford to have their own business or own their own home, or at least rent a house, that kind of thing. Maybe buy a car, maybe not. Certainly afford to, go to, to dress, have a Sunday best suit and, dress and hat, that kind of thing. So you could have a postal worker in Washington, D.C. who would be part of the black elite. You could also have someone who was making $1 million, part of the black elite too. You could have a barber, part of the black elite. Now, there's also a component of black elite that's also about colorism, because in the 1920s, especially in these northern cities where the populations of African Americans hadn't been very large, there's the brown paper bag rule, where if you are darker than a brown paper bag, you could not be part of the elite. You can be part of the in crowd. That actually starts to change, in no small part because of black migration and the emergence of the idea of the new Negro, a term that's coined by Alain Locke, who's a philosophy professor at Howard University at the time. But it's also kind of part of a larger movement among black folk as part of migration. They take off all the shackles, both among African Americans and outside of African America, so to speak, with regard to thinking about things certain ways, like the brown paper bag rule. Now, it doesn't go away. There are aspects of the brown paper bag rule that we still have to deal with as black folk, and quite frankly as American folk, to this day. Light skin privilege, that we call it, as we call it among black folk, right? Light and, the 1A to 3C kind of, wavy or actually straight or straightish hair kinds of things, right? So there's that aspect of things. But the reality is there is a black elite, and they're not entirely happy with these black folk who are migrating to these cities and deal in the poverty that doesn't come with them, but comes as a result of them being in places where they're being discriminated against and being part of the working class, which Blair Kelly spends a lot of time talking about in her book, that the dissuade the idea that the working class is only white and that the working class has always had living income, which has not always been the case. About the middle class black folk who well, let me rephrase, working class black folk automatically not existing because black people didn't work when all black people have basically done since they've been to this country is work. They were brought here, kidnapped here, beat the work, and so on and so forth. So she goes through a lot of that to try to show the relationship between black fights for freedom in terms of whether it's talking about mass mobilization like the civil rights movement or the mass mobilization that we call black migration. Those are actually fights for freedom without them being truly violent acts, right? And those are also people part of the community. So these are multi dimensional communities in terms of socioeconomics, right? In terms of race, in terms of colorism, in terms of these other things. So you have this mix that pretty much exists until the time that the Kenneth Kuzmers and Gilbert Oslowskis and other folks are writing about generational poverty among African Americans and cultural poverty thesis as well by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and so on and so forth. Where does all that come from? And that gets to a larger historical thing, like the thing that drives all historians, whether they're professional historians or casual history students who want to be historians, kinds of things, crazy. I write outside the context of academia. I write for Al Jazeera. I've written for any number of places now, I guess, over the last decade or so. And the one thing that drives me crazy as a writer and as a historian is how people automatically think I'm just spouting my opinion. I'm just doing stuff off the cuff. I'm not thinking anything through, right? When you could argue that Kenneth Kuzma and Gilbert Oslowski and Alan Spear, who writes about Black Chicago and the making of a ghetto there, among other people, right, is that they have biases. Their biases might include being racist, might include racist interpretations that they didn't think were racist at the time, to be honest with you, right? It might include all of that. But they're still basing it on something. They're not just literally just making up stuff and doing stuff, right? And so with students, particularly they've taken classes with me like historical methods, I point out there's a difference between facts, opinion, and interpretation, right? I'll give you a fact. Beyonce's the most popular, if not one of the three most popular female artists in the world, period, right now, right this minute, February of 2024. Right, that's a fact. Now, your opinion can be that she's the greatest thing that's in terms of a musical diva who's ever existed on the planet. There will never be one greater than her. There was never one even on her level. No matter how much I can say Diana Ross or Donna Summer or any number of other people. What do I know? I'm just a historian, right? That would be one way of looking at it. But there are ways to try to prove your hypothesis. The hypothesis is Beyonce is, say, one of the most popular folks of her time, period. Probably in the top three, if not number one, right? Rihanna might be up there for a lot of people. There might be Taylor Swift for other people, whatever, right? I don't care. I actually don't care. I have no skin in the game, right? But I'm just throwing out that as an example. A way to go about interpretation is based on facts, but it's based on facts in context, right? How do you objectively measure popularity? Well, there are a lot of ways. Number of LPs sold, or individual singles or EPs. How many times has this person been downloaded, listened to on Spotify? There could be any number of measures. Now, keep in mind, half the measures I just named existed more in, say, Diana Ross's time, or say Janet Jackson's time, or say Donna Summer's time, and the other ones, the social media and music app ones, have only existed for maybe the last 10 or 20 years. So there's no real way to quantify popularity in the case of Beyonce versus Diana Ross versus whatever, right? If you were to take Diana Ross's sales and extrapolate them at her height of her popularity to where things are now, maybe she is on par with Beyonce, maybe not, right? I don't know, right? But the way to basically interpret all that is to say Beyonce is the most popular female diva of our time. However, she's popular in an era in which social media has a gigantic influence on how people see people as popular in the first place, right? And if social media didn't exist, say 30 years ago the way it does now, and all 40 years ago the way we think about it in any way, shape, or form, certainly 50 or more years ago, then it is impossible to really quantify the differences in levels of Beyonce versus other people. So let's just give her dap, her props for what she's able to do now, but when it comes to looking at it from a historical perspective, she's at best maybe on par with the people who came before her, but there's no real way to measure that beyond just record sales and being able to extrapolate certain things. That's interpretation. You're not just spouting, crap off your head. You're really thinking through, well, how will I go about proving this idea, proving this hypothesis, proving this thing that I think is an automatic given? If you think it's an automatic given, then you're in the realm of opinion, and you can't possibly prove an opinion. From that perspective, everybody's right and everybody's also wrong. Right? It's not about opinion. It's about being able to take those facts and being able to process them with good questions, probing questions to try to get at what you're trying to say. And if you can't prove it, then you kind of need to back off of that hypothesis, right? Slow your roll a little bit about saying Beyonce is the most popular one that ever was and will ever be, kind of thing. She's not God, right? That kind of thing, right? But in interpretation, you need to do more than that. How does this relate to black migration? I'll explain it, right? If you are coming off of a period of gigantic prosperity, which the U.S. was in the period between, say, 1945 and the mid-1970s, then you, as a white historian, particularly as a white historian, but you could also be a black one too, but you could be a historian that looks at black migration. Look at the fact that there are large sectors of these black communities in which families, individual, people have been left behind, right? And you are starting to see by the late 60s and early 70s a shift where some of the black elite are starting to leave these communities. So poverty is becoming concentrated in these neighborhoods. And they're also trying to explain, in the midst of all this U.S. prosperity, why there's so much poverty and why black folk are so angry to the point where they're willing to have what people were calling the 60s race riots. This is different from the way the term race riots is used prior to the 1960s. It can't be a race riot though if the only people rioting are black, right? Or if most of the people rioting are black. Now, if white people join in with those riots, start burning down businesses that sell liquor and alcohol and tobacco and all these other things, fine, I guess you could call it a race riot. But if you can call it a riot against racism or an uprising against racism, as a lot of people would prefer the riots in the 1960s to be called, then they're not really race riots. They're riots about people living with the everyday realities of systemic racism, the poverty, the crime, and the police lethality that tends to produce. And that's what they're responding to. And that's what the historians who are writing about these ghettos, so to speak, are responding to this whole notion of the inner city and all this other stuff. They're responding to all of that. And so they're using that sort of thinking, including the cultural poverty thesis, which was a very popular thesis among sociologists like Daniel Patrick Moynihan in the 1960s and 70s. And so that's what's riddled in their writing, right? Riddled in their use of census data, riddled in their look at the formation of communities, looking at statistics around how many people within these neighborhoods are living with poverty, and do statistics about students who drop out of school, and about black mothers who become, black women who become mothers, or black girls who become mothers between the ages roughly of 13 and 20, and all those sorts of things. It's embedded in all of that, right? So there's an interpretation there based on the facts that they had. Now, they could have interviewed black people to ask them what they went through. They could have looked more at redlining and other issues, but they didn't back then because they were operating with a different sort of ideas, hypotheses, questions that they wanted to ask and answer. Questions that involve, quite frankly, the white gaze, right? And that blindingly glaring gaze that kind of obfuscates and erases the other things that people are going through. So hopefully that crash course in facts, opinions, and interpretations works for folks. Hopefully the Beyonce thing works for you. If it doesn't, I can come up with 100 other ones, right? But this is just something to get you started to be thinking about the things that you're reading for this week.